Ward is an ability that can feel a lot like Hexproof when you need to target something on an opponent's board and can't afford the tax. But Ward and Hexproof are mechanically different keywords that have very different strategic implications. In this video, we're going to start by looking at the differences between Hexproof and Ward. We'll then talk about Ward's mechanics in more detail so that you can make more strategic plays and use your knowledge to get an edge. Let's start with the technical definition. Ward is a triggered ability. It triggers when your permanent becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls. On the Ward triggers resolution, the opponent either pays the cost or their spell or ability gets countered. When they target your creature, Ward triggers and goes on the stack above their spell. The Ward trigger resolves first. If they pay, their spell stays. If not, their spell gets countered. Ward costs can be mana, life, discarding, even sacrificing. The opponent must pay each ward cost that triggers. How is this different from Hexproof? Hexproof is a static ability that prevents targeting in the first place. A player or permanent with Hexproof simply cannot be the target of spells or abilities their opponents control. If an effect like Heroic Intervention gives a permanent Hexproof in response to a spell that targets it, then that permanent becomes an illegal target when the spell targeting it resolves. When trying to determine if Ward is relevant to something you're trying to do, remember that it only triggers on targeting. Board wipes and edict-style effects don't target creatures. They affect everything. This means Ward never triggers. The fact that Ward is a triggered ability opens synergies you can use to your advantage or your opponent's disadvantage. If you have something like a roaming throne that gives you additional triggered abilities for creatures of a certain type, you'll benefit from additional Ward triggers. It can also be copied by something like a Strionic Resonator. The fact that Ward counters a spell or ability is also something you have to pay close attention to. If you have a spell like Void Rend that can't be countered, then Ward is not able to counter the removal spell. Lyre, Disciple of the Drowned, similarly prevents spells from being countered, and so Ward becomes useless with her in play. Ward still triggers, but spells just can't be countered by it. It's important to note that paying the cost of casting a spell and paying the Ward cost are technically different. When faced with a Ward 2 creature, many players will just tap 2+ however much other mana they need to target it, and essentially pay it all in one lump sum. As with a lot of things in this game, we take shortcuts for the sake of time and convenience. And that's totally fine, as long as everyone understands what's actually implied by that and what's actually happening in the game. They're basically saying, I'm going to tap my mana ahead of time and agree to pay the Ward cost while it's on the stack so that I don't have to say that later. But in instances where it might matter that Ward is a triggered ability that goes on the stack, it's worth slowing down and going through the resolutions one by one so that nobody feels like they got hustled by an implicit shortcut. Let's try a quick pop quiz so that you can test your understanding of Hexproof and Ward. Pause the video if you need more time to think about the answers. And remember, the key word you're looking for when thinking about Hexproof and Ward is target. Alright, let's dive in. Your opponent casts Soul Shatter. Your only creature on the battlefield has Ward 2, and you have an effect that can give it Hexproof in response. Should you give it Hexproof to save it, or is the fact that it has Ward 2 enough to protect it from the Soul Shatter? The answer is neither. Soul Shatter is an edict effect that does not target, so you would be wasting your Hexproof effect by playing it in response. Similarly, Ward only cares about targeting, and Soul Shatter does not target, so neither Hexproof nor Ward will protect your creature from the Soul Shatter. You have a roaming throne in play, and have chosen the only creature type you have on the battlefield. Your opponent casts a Path to Exile targeting your Ward 2 creature. How much total mana do they need to pay for Ward? A, 4, B, 2, C, 6. The answer is A. Ward triggers twice because of Roaming Throne, meaning that they will need to pay 2 instances of 2 mana for their spell to not be countered. You're up against an opponent who is playing an equipment deck, and they equip Winged Boots to their Ward 2 creature. How much mana do you need to pay if you want to target their creature? A, 4 mana because the new instance of Ward on the creature overrides the first. B, 2 mana because a creature cannot have multiple instances of Ward. C, 6 mana because multiple instances of Ward are not redundant, and each will trigger separately? The answer is C. Some keywords like flying and trample are redundant, but ward is not one of them. Each instance triggers separately, and you will need to pay 6 mana if you don't want a spell or ability to be countered by their 2 instances of ward. It's your turn, and your opponent targets your Ward 2 creature with Anguished Unmaking. In response to the ward trigger, you cast Deflecting Swat and change the target to one of their permanents. What happens to the ward trigger? A. The ward trigger is removed from the stack because you change the target of the spell. B. Your opponent can decline to pay once the ward trigger resolves, which counters Anguished Unmaking. C. You now have to decide whether you'll pay the ward cost, because you now control the spell. The correct answer is B. Ward already triggered when your creature was first targeted. Because it's your turn, you get first priority to respond to the ward trigger going on the stack. After Deflecting Swat resolves and you change the target of Anguished Unmaking, the ward trigger is still on the stack. If nobody else has an effect, then the ward trigger resolves and makes the spell's controller choose whether to pay 2. If they don't pay, Anguished Unmaking is countered, even though it no longer targets your creature. If they do pay, it resolves and exiles their permanent. Let's talk about why the others are wrong. A. Changing targets doesn't remove a ward trigger from the stack. C. SWAT changes the target, not the controller of the spell. This is an example of a scenario where you and your opponent would want to take the triggers one at a time, instead of your opponent saying they will pay the ward and the cost of their Anguished Unmaking at the same time that they put the spell on the stack. Once you've changed the target of their spell, they probably won't want to pay the ward and allow their permanent to be exiled by their own spell and lose 3 life in the process. Last question. Your opponent targets your artifact creature that has Ward 2 with a Frozen Grip, which has Split Second. As a reminder, Split Second means as long as this spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. The question is, what happens? A. Ward can't trigger because it's an activated ability, and Split Second says activated abilities cannot be activated. B. Ward will still go on the stack above Frozen Grip because Ward is not a spell or activated ability. C. Ward will still go on the stack above Frozen Grip, but the Split Second will counter it because it's an activated ability. The correct answer is B. While Frozen Grip stops spells and activated abilities from being put on the stack, it says nothing about triggered abilities, and Ward is a triggered ability. So your opponent will still have to decide whether or not to pay the ward cost. That's it. Hexproof versus Ward. What they do and when to use them. Edge cases happen. Now you have the tools you need to spot and deal with them when they come up. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.